Hello, 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 Dr. Rice.
Good morning.
Good morning. So this is going to be the part three of our series, Menopause and the Brain, where we're going to discuss the role of estrogen in brain and cognitive aging. In our first session, if you remember, we discussed how our brain relies on estrogen to keep it healthy and functioning optimally. In our second session, we discussed the loss of estrogen at the time of perimenopause and menopause, and how it leads to the symptoms that women experience, such as hot flashes, mood changes, and brain fog. In this session, we are going to focus on an extremely important issue, and that is, does taking estrogen in the form of HRT, hormone replacement therapy, help prevent dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease? Or is it harmful? There is already evidence that taking estrogen, estradiol, early during the menopause transition can really have a positive effect on reducing chronic diseases linked to the heart, to the bone. And so, yes, could this really benefit our brain or not? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, this is such an important subject, Natalie, because women just are confused about whether or not hormones are good for the brain or not. And so hopefully by the end of this presentation, they'll have a much better understanding of how estrogen and HRT will affect their future risk of dementia. So a lot of women, I think, are under the impression that hormones are harmful. And part of the reason for this is that when they go to a pharmacy, they will end up getting a bottle, their prescription, and along with that, a whole 4 or 5 pages of information about the benefits and risks. And when they read through this carefully, guess what they see? Hormone therapy may cause and could cause probable dementia. So obviously this is very frightening to women. So the reason we need to figure out why are women seeing this warning? Where is that coming from? Early in my years of practice, back in the 80s and 90s, we routinely prescribed hormones because, as you mentioned, they were good for the chronic diseases, the heart, the bones, and also all the studies to that point suggested that they were good for dementia. So again, we didn't see these warnings until the last 20 years. So the question is, why are women seeing these warnings on their estrogen prescription? The reason is that in 2002, a huge study called the Women's Health Initiative study came out. And this was designed to be the biggest, most powerful study to determine the benefits and risks of hormone therapy. And so while we expected it to show that it would benefit all the chronic diseases that you mentioned, as well as dementia, it showed just the opposite. So I think it's really important that women understand this, because that is the basis for all of those warnings that you're seeing on these hormones. The headlines actually came out and back in 2002 and showed that HRT doubles the risk of dementia.
But we have discussed this in the past, and I think we mention it, pretty much every time we do a recording together.
Yes.
And you described it so much, so well in your book, and you're going to tell us more, toward the end of this. There are many shortcomings to this WHI study.
Yeah, and that is another message we want to get across, because
people need to know. People need to know.
Yeah, it's really important that women understand that, why are they seeing these warnings? So let's talk a little bit about the WHI. So the WHI was a huge study. It cost millions of dollars and enrolled thousands of women. And one part of the study was the subset study called the Women's Health Initiative Memory Study. And let me tell you about how this worked. Basically, there were about 4,000 women in this particular part of the study. And of those, about half, 2,000, were on hormone treatment, and the other half were on a sugar pill, a placebo. And at the end of the 5 years, they looked to see how many women fulfilled the criteria for dementia. So before I go into just, giving you the full details of results, let me explain those issues that you and I have talked about, Natalie, about the problems with the WHI, and particularly this part of the study. So the first thing to be aware of is that the women in the study were all much older than when women normally take hormone therapy. Half were over they were all over 65, and half were actually over 70. And this is when they actually started their hormone replacement therapy. Now, normally we start right at the time of menopause, which is around the 50, age 50. The other issue is the study did not go on too long, very long. It was 5.2 years, and actually this part of the study was probably was only 4 years. But that's not really very much time to really assess, whether or not dementia will develop, because it's just not that much time. It's a chronic disease that goes over many years. The other important issue is that there were 2 hormones used in the study. One was called Premarin, that was the estrogen, and the other was a fairly strong synthetic progesterone-like drug called medroxyprogesterone. Neither of these are natural hormones that our ovary makes, but these were the ones that were used at the time. That was the only drugs doctors really had available for HRT. So those were the ones in the study.
And Premarin, Premarin was the one extracted from mare urine, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
It's good for horses, but
yeah.
it's different from and it was natural to horses,
Yeah,
but
natural,
it's not one
not
identical to the estrogen that
exactly.
you make.
Yeah, and the other point to make, though, is also that it was only the women that took both of these drugs, the Premarin and the progesterone, that showed an increased risk. Women who were just on an estrogen, Premarin, didn't show the risk. So what were the results? Well, of the 2,000 women who were on both drugs, on the hormones, there were 41 cases of dementia at the end of the study period. And of the 2,000 women that were on placebo, there were 20. This equates to 21 more cases out of 2,000, which is basically 1 in 100. So 1 in 100 women were at risk from getting dementia. These older women at risk of getting dementia from taking these hormones. And the issue is that the problem is that because this was the only huge study we had at the time, and continues to be the only huge study, the FDA has mandated that the drug companies put that warning for dementia on all their hormones.
This is really important information, Sandy. As your slide of the headlines indicated, women were told all over the world that taking hormone replacement therapy, HRT, could double the risk of dementia. And not everybody is a biologist or a physician. And being able to read the fine prints. I mean, this is true.
Right.
Twice as many women on HRT were diagnosed with it. But as you pointed out, the actual numbers were very low.
You're right.
And
absolute numbers.
The actual risk was very small.
Yep.
And this has changed. This study with 4,000 women, and we don't know, well, we know that they were over 65. We don't know much more about them, about the color of their skin or their comorbidities, the genetic predispositions. So this influenced the entire, and we are there 20 years lager, and
20 years later, yeah, and we've generalized the study to apply to all women and to all hormones, which simply, it just, women should realize that's just not appropriate.
Correct.
So let's talk a little bit about dementia. Just make sure everybody's on the same page. So dementia basically is a condition of brain damage to the extent where you can't function. And it's a slow process, and it affects various parts of our brain kind of on different trajectories. But very typically it'll start out with issues with memory and mood, judgment, affects the personality. It affects our ability to learn, affects our ability to communicate. And as time goes on, essentially it affects one's ability to even take care of themselves and eventually even move or walk. So dementia is a general term, and lots of things can cause it. In women, the main cause is Alzheimer's disease, affecting at least 70% of women who end up with the diagnosis of dementia. The second most common is what we call vascular disease. And vascular disease is a condition where a person has suffered many little or big strokes over time that have caused enough brain cell damage that they end up with dementia. And then there's a whole host of others that I've listed on this slide. Parkinson's disease is associated with a dementia. Lewy body dementia is a kind of a subset of that. Certainly people who have had head trauma, like boxers and football players, multiple concussions and trauma can lead to dementia. And then infection and inflammation, a whole host of other things that can cause brain damage. So those are all causes of dementia.
This is very useful. Thank you so much for explaining this. Alzheimer's is very scary, and as your chart indicates it is the leading cause of dementia. 1 out of 6 women will develop it at some point.
Yeah.
So for this reason, we want to focus on the relationship of menopause and estrogen and Alzheimer's disease, because we described how estrogen relates to Alzheimer's. Can you talk more about Alzheimer's in general?
Yeah, I think in order for us to really understand, how menopause and how estrogen affect Alzheimer's, we need to know a little bit about Alzheimer's. So let's just start with some basic anatomy. This is a brain. And
if we like anatomy.
Yeah. if we took a little teeny tiny, biopsy piece of brain and examine it under a microscope, we would see it's composed of billions and billions of nerve cells. And each of these little guys represents a nerve cell. Another name for nerve cells is neuron. And these nerve cells are packed into our brain. Our brain's like a computer. These neurons are sending chemical and electric messages back and forth, processing information, storing information, sending out signals to our body, to make it function. So, these neurons are, the brain is amazing when you really think about what it can do. So let's focus in on a neuron. And a neuron itself is a pretty complicated little guy, but we're going to focus on just a couple elements of a basic healthy neuron. So this one little curly Q thing here is a protein called Tau, T-A-U, Tau. And it actually kind of is throughout the neuron, these little guys, and it is basically a structural element. It helps kind of maintain like the skeleton of the neuron.
It's the cytoskeleton protein, right?
Yes, yes. And another function of the neuron is that it makes proteins. It makes all sorts of proteins for it to do the work it needs to do. So this is demonstrated with these little dots, and these proteins are made and released and packaged and go from neuron to neuron or into the circulation. And one of the proteins that we are talking about in Alzheimer's is a protein called amyloid. So these are two components that are important to know when we talk about Alzheimer's. So what happens in Alzheimer's is that something affects the nerve cell such that it just doesn't function as normally. And what happens is the TAW gets deformed and disrupted and chemically altered, and it ends up, getting all tangled up. So we call these little TAW, tangled TAW. And then the neuron just can't process the proteins, and it can't eliminate them and make them into little particles where they can go from cell to cell. So they end up kind of just ending up kind of like, little garbage dumps, little protein amyloid clumps. So these are called amyloid clumps, and these are called tangled TAW. Those are words that you hear a lot about when we talk about Alzheimer's. So what happens, though, over time, whatever starts this process kind of snowballs, and we end up getting sick and damaged nerve cells, interspersed through normal nerve cells, and these clumps of amyloid interspersed. And what happens it's like, the brain can't function very well because there's in these areas that aren't transmitting information or doing their jobs.
They're dying.
Yeah, exactly. They're dying. And then on top of that, these damaged cells and these amyloid clumps, the body's reaction is to send in its army of inflammation chemicals and inflammation cells to try to clear them out and help the process. But as we know, a lot of times when inflammation flares up, that actually causes more damage. So things really do start to snowball to the extent that more and more nerve cells get damaged, and there's less and less brain matter to function. And we actually can see that in advanced Alzheimer's. Here's a normal brain. Here's the skull on the outside, and the normal brain occupies pretty much all that skull. And then here we have an Alzheimer's patient, and you can see between the top of the brain and the skull, there's a lot of empty space there. I mean, the skull, the brain has actually shrunk. There's just so many brain cells that have been damaged from Alzheimer's that this person has a smaller brain and can't function.
It's quite amazing that we can use the PET studies and this type of, you're going to tell me.
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, for years there, we really had a hard time diagnosing Alzheimer's, try to differentiate it from other kinds of dementia. But it's just amazing how technology has improved, just even in my career. We have these super duper scans called PET scans. This is what you were mentioning, Natalie. And what these are is that they're chemicals that can be, get injected into the vein like a little shot. And they specifically can go out and hook themselves on to any kind of amyloid clumps. So here's a fairly normal brain. And then over here, all this red, this is showing up the amyloid clump. So this person has a lot of amyloid, in their brain, which would go along, of course, with Alzheimer's. And similarly, you can do a scan that looks for TAW. And again, this person, you can see a big accumulation of TAW right here. Yeah. So this would be a scan of a patient with Alzheimer's.
So do we know about the path to Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I think that just to review that is that it's something starts the process, right? Something starts the process. We're not really sure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we start getting an accumulation of TAW and amyloid, and perhaps the person isn't even having symptoms initially. But then with the inflammation and its worsening effects from the inflammation, we get more cell damage, progressive cell death, and then dementia. So that's what we talk about as far as the path to Alzheimer's.
So now that we understand the process of Alzheimer's, let's talk about estrogen. No, more women than men get Alzheimer's, and actually twice as much. And this has been shown to be not just the fact that women live longer. There has been a number of articles coming out over the last few years, not even 10 years, pointing to menopause, I would say, 5 years, pointing to menopause being a risk factor for Alzheimer's. And and that it may be the loss of estrogen that is a big problem. So would you guide us through the research done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, what I hope people listen to what you said, Natalie, because that's so important. We seem to focus in on, oh, here's this, here's these amyloid and tau clumps, and they suddenly are there, and people suddenly has Alzheimer's. But it starts way back, and the fascinating research right now that I think people really are aware of is that, okay, why do women get more Alzheimer's than men? Well, women go through menopause. Is there something about menopause that's jump-starting or initially the inciting factors that can cause the beginnings of what can lead to Alzheimer's? And we talked about we'll be going through all these, answering some of these questions as we go along. But to start with, at the beginning level, let's talk about, well, what happens during even perimenopause and menopause that could be affecting these nerve cells, that could be the start of a problem. Well, in our first talk, Natalie, we talked a lot about all the estrogen effects in the brain, both in men and women throughout our life. And one of the main roles of estrogen basically in all mammals, for ages, for eons, estrogen has been a big factor in getting glucose into our nerve cells. So this is an idealized nerve cell, and it with the engines, you have a car and you have an engine. The engines of our nerve cells are called mitochondria, and those are these little beans here. So the glucose, the mitochondria need the glucose to function, and estrogen helps put the glucose into the cell so these mitochondria can function. And so what basically happens is that we go through menopause, our estrogen level goes down, the glucose aren't getting into the neurons as efficiently, and so these neurons aren't functioning. They're just not functioning. And we're talking about, early in menopause. And
we're talking about energy change. I mean, at the very beginning, the estrogen are going down, levels are going down. So we have a change in energy.
Exactly. Well, and brain energy. And that's why, that's why. So women who are going through perimenopause and menopause, they can't figure out why their brains aren't quite working. I mean, they don't have the energy to work, right? So that's kind of our first clue. Go, oh yeah, maybe there is something not so good going into our brains, right?
Many question actually having dementia.
Yeah, exactly. They actually think they are, and then of course they go, well, I can't be. I'm only 50. How can I be having dementia, right? But really, and we've talked about to validate women. You're not going crazy. There's stuff happening in your brain that you can't control. So what, again, to further go on with the slide. So menopause, ovaries quit making estrogen. We don't have the estrogen. The neurons aren't getting what they need. They're not getting fueled. But then what happens over the next, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years, the brain cells, since they're not getting their glucose, they are looking for alternate fuel. One is which ketones, and we've heard about how our bodies sometimes resort to ketones, which are not as, necessarily as good a fuel, and they could even, lead to some other toxic chemicals down the line. And there's some of the researchers we've talked about, Natalie, the menopause researchers are looking at how, if some of your brain cells aren't working in one area, they're trying to utilize some other brain cells and pulling other brain cells into function, and it's just like kind of putting so much stress on your brain that eventually, you just don't have the brain power. The cells just can't keep functioning forever, under these conditions.
Well, may I interject and say one thing also that I've read? We want to make clear that menopause does not lead to dementia, right?
Yes.
We are looking at how menopause in some women would be linked to a certain rate or increased risk for dementia, and that's important because at this point, between the beginning of perimenopause and the age where dementia reveals itself, there are many ways for the brain to adapt.
Right, exactly, right. And
And
some women just genetically aren't as able, yeah.
exactly, to adapt. And we will talk in the last session of this series, we will talk about ways to help nourish the brain, right? Fuel the brain and avoid the alternate fuel like ketones and things like that. So I just wanted to bring it up here because
Yeah. We're not implying that every woman who goes through menopause is
oh,
dementia.
no,
That
no,
would not be good, but certainly more women than men get it. We're
exactly.
all at risk, and so there is something
There's
about the
there's
XX
something
brain.
there. There is
Yeah, yeah,
something there
yeah,
and something
yeah,
about
yeah.
genetics. I'll let you
And
finish. Sorry,
right.
I interrupted.
No, that's fine. I don't want to mislead people. But so the issue is then why would estrogen help? If we're kind of saying, well, it's we're again, I'm not gonna at the end, I'm gonna emphasize that estrogen is not recommended as a treatment for menopause, but just to, open women's minds to the fact that maybe there is something about estrogen and the loss of estrogen that's an issue. And that's what we're going to talk about here is, how would estrogen help? Why would estrogen be a help? Well, let's go back to our path, which we looked at, the series over time. And then let's talk about how estrogen might have a beneficial effect. Well, I've kind of emphasized that estrogen helps promote glucose into the nerve cells to fuel them. So it's possible that lack of estrogen early on is a factor in perhaps some of those cells, not being able to function normally, and then initially maybe it increases the accumulation of tau and amyloid. Now, it also has been shown in the lab, on various research studies that estrogen actually can help clear out the amyloid, and it can also maybe prevent the tau from sticking or deteriorating. Just like estrogen helps prevent our bones from deteriorating. There's some evidence that it actually helps the nerve cells. And then we do know that estrogen has powerful anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects in other areas of our body, in the cardiovascular system and in our joints, actually. And it also has these properties in the brain, which would tend to, maybe mitigate or limit some of the inflammation that's going on. And so with all these effects, it's possible that estrogen can retard brain cell death and delay the onset of dementia. So I think there's some interesting food for thought here that we want people to be aware of as far as
It makes sense.
estrogen's effect.
Sense.
Yeah. In fact, that was that, and then my theme here that a lot of neuroscientists, will tell you estrogen is neuroprotective. It has some properties that might help, protect our brain cells. So that's my little neuroprotective lady.
It's awesome. So these benefits of estrogen makes a good case that taking HRT after menopause or at the transition itself and having estrogen in our system would help.
Exactly. And
But
yeah, and then sorry.
would you be able to go over some of the other reasons why we believe that losing estrogen is not good for our brains and why estrogen replacement would be beneficial for the women who can take it?
Exactly. So let's start with some of the animal studies. There's been a lot of research on animals. If you remove an animal's ovaries, you put them into menopause, and they've actually shown that with rats and mice and guinea pigs, that if you take their ovaries out, they actually cognitively don't perform as well. You probably ask, well, how do you know if a rat has cognitive problems or not? But
Very
apparently,
smart animal.
yeah. They can't navigate mazes as well. And then if you put them on estrogens, they seem to do better. But what's even more telling is that there have been studies where if you take a rat's ovaries and don't treat them with estrogen, they actually build up more amyloid. So that's kind of suggestive that estrogen might help. The other area that has made us suspect that estrogen is important for our brains is with women who have to have their ovaries removed well before menopause. And this is a busy slide, and I don't expect anyone to really digest this, but there was 3 big studies that I've listed here. And what they looked at is the risk of dementia in women who have had their ovaries out versus, the age that they had their ovaries out. And that's a busy slide, so I've kind of summarized it with this particular slide, taking those 3 studies and summarizing it. And basically what this is showing is, let's go way over to the right here. If a woman has her ovaries removed before the age of 34 for some reason and doesn't take hormones, in a couple of those studies, the risk was as high as 8 times her risk of getting dementia if she went, all these years without her estrogen. And then as you get closer to menopause, the risk diminishes, so that if you had your ovaries taken out between 34 and 43, the risk may be a little up to almost 4 times the risk. If you had them taken out between 43 and 48, it's like, 3 times the risk. And if you had your ovaries taken out over the age of 48, remember that natural menopause can occur in age 55. So again, a 48-year-old woman, could have 7 years of, lack of estrogen, before she normally would if she didn't have her ovaries taken out. So the point of the slide is that there's been many studies that have shown that if you take a woman's ovaries out before the time of natural menopause, she is at risk for some cognitive damage. And to the extent that pretty much it's standard recommendations now, if there isn't a contraindication if a woman has her ovaries removed when she's young, she really should be on HRT, at least until the age when she, would normally go through menopause.
This is for induced menopause.
Yeah. So again, this is not proof, but it's suggestive that women do need hormones.
Yeah.
If they're going to go through early menopause. So the next bit of evidence when you're requesting is studies. Now, we talked about the WHI. The WHI is still the dominant study that's dictating all those warnings and guidelines. But there have been a lot of other studies. There's been a lot of other studies that have looked at hormone replacement and cognition. And rather than list all of them, then I'm putting a couple articles that kind of summarized a bunch of articles, and that's what's called a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a paper that's looked at a number of studies over a long period of time, and then kind of, maybe one study showed some benefit, one study showed some harm, and then it kind of, summarizes it and comes up with a conclusion. Now, this is a paper that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2001. This was before the WHI, and its conclusions. This study found a decreased risk of dementia in HRT users. And that's what I was saying initially, Natalie, is that, when I was in practice early, that's what the studies were saying, that, HRT was good for dementia. We then had the WHI, which kind of, exploded and just turned our world upside down, in which, women still, guidelines still look at that study. But since that study, there have been a number of smaller studies. And here's a very recent study, 2020, from a journal called Frontiers in Neuroscience. And the article was called The Effect of Estrogen Replacement Therapy on Alzheimer's Disease and Parkinson's Disease in Postmenopausal Women. So that's basically the effect of HRT in women beyond menopause. And again, a meta-analysis looked at a whole bunch of studies that were done, since the WHI. And the conclusion was, our results showed that ERT significantly decreased the risk of Alzheimer's or the development of Alzheimer's disease. So we have all these studies that kind of are they contradict to the WHI study. But again, because the WHI study is what we call a controlled study where some women get the hormones and some women don't, and then they're followed, that's considered the gold standard. So we again, the powers that be really keep looking at that study as the definitive study, even though it really should only be a study on older women on those drugs.
Yeah. So between all these studies and the other information you have presented, and it seems really strange, and strange is a weak word.
Yeah.
That women are still being warned that estrogen may increase the risk of dementia. I mean, this is just unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's, and again, it's the power of, you know, the way that science is trying to report things that
There's
we
a gap there.
exactly.
Just saying. So,
Oh, but let me. Oh, sorry, Natalie. I did forget. Yeah, there was one more thought.
oh, I'm so
Sorry,
sorry.
go ahead. But there was one more. I had just said that we don't have a big study like the WHI, but we've had a couple studies similar to the WHI, but just not as powerful to negate its findings. And so let me just, at the risk of, I know people don't like studies too much, but you know, it's important to know that there's the data out there.
You make it so clear.
Yeah, so thank you. And one, here's an interesting factoid that I had already told you about that WHI study that looked at women over 65. Now, in 2013, which is what, 11 years since the study came out, they actually went back and looked at some of the younger women that were in the WHI. As the WHI, the whole study, there was, you know, 28,000 women, but the average age was 62. But there were some women that entered the study when they were around 50 to 55. It was a small number. And they went back and looked at those women who took hormones. And there was about 1,300. They didn't show any increased risk of dementia. So here, again, we have more evidence that there's something about giving hormones to older women that's not so good. But again, most of these other studies have been with younger women, you know, younger women who normally take estrogens around age 50. And then we have two other studies, one that came out in 2016 and 2019. One was called the ELITE study and one was called the KEEPS. You know, these are names for longer, hard to pronounce studies. And they again had less than, you know, certainly not the thousands of women that were in the WHI. But both of these studies were what they call controlled studies. They put some women on hormones and some women on a sugar pill and followed them for each of these for about 5 years, and then looked to see if there was any evidence of dementia in these younger women. And these studies did not find an increase, no increase. So that, I mean, that's just, you know, again, reassuring. They didn't find a decrease, but again, as we talked about, 5 years isn't, you know, a very long time to know the effects of any kind of hormone therapy. So that's encouraging, but not powerful enough to negate the findings of the WHI, unfortunately. And the other very interesting thing about this KEEP study was they actually looked at 100 women who agreed to have these PET scans over the I think it was annually, or maybe it was every 2 years. But they found that women who did take transdermal estradiol, which is considered the natural estrogen that we are encouraging women to take, they actually showed less amyloid over that short period of time than women on a placebo. So that's, you know, that's pretty powerful stuff. But again, very small number of women that were in these studies.
Mm-hmm. So the conclusion from those controls trials in younger women is that taking HRT at least for the first 5 years doesn't appear to be harmful.
Exactly.
When it's really a problem, is really for women over 65.
Yes, yeah, to start taking hormones at that
Start
point.
taking after 10 to 15 years
Yep.
post menopause. Yeah.
So it'd be nice to have another study as big as the WHI, but I mean, we're talking millions of dollars, and you know, even if the NIH or we got this, or there was some funding for that, I mean, women aren't going to know. They're not going to know anything for years to come. You know, so that's why we're presenting, you know, the data that we do know. So I think just to conclude, was there?
Yeah, I wish we had more studies and hopefully more research, will focus on this area. This is a reason why some of us are involved in fundraisers and community outreach, to really bring awareness. This is the power of these times, our times, through webinars and YouTube videos and social media. This is what we can do. So what with that, we need to wrap things up. Any final remarks?
Yeah, I think just just to summarize, as you mentioned, Alzheimer's is very common. It's a devastating disease, both for the patient and the families, and really we don't have any cure for it. And even the drugs that are out there today, the drugs that you hear for Alzheimer's, I mean, they're really not very good. They may slow down things a little bit, but they're really not that effective, unfortunately. So the what we need to focus on is prevention, in that Alzheimer's starts many years before the symptoms appear. So there's things we should be looking at to perhaps be aggressive about, to prevent future problems. And that, as you mentioned, Natalie, is going to be the focus on our final segment. And the question that we've talked about today is estrogen one of those things? I have to again emphasize that estrogen is not recommended as a preventative therapy, but based on the studies that I've shown and the science that we have, it doesn't appear harmful. As you mentioned, it does not appear to be harmful. So that's reassuring. And as you know, I'm a huge huge fan of hormone therapy, hormone replacement therapy, for all of its other beneficial effects. But I'm not here to to try to twist women's arms or coerce them into taking hormones. But what I do want, and what we both want, is for women to be informed and educated. And I'll just put a little plug in for my book. That's why I wrote, or subtitled my book, "No Before You Say No to HRT," because so many women have this knee-jerk, "Oh, I'm not taking them, it causes dementia." We want women to know.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I mean, this book, for anyone who is listening, is a Bible. It's been recommended by the North American Menopause Society. If you like to look at things, very precisely, the way Sandra analyzes things and writes, please go and get that book. I think it's science-based, it's fact-based, it's a lot of research. This is why, Sandy and I get along. Like to share. Again, I mean, we're not here to promote one thing or the other, what the facts, what we've been hearing. I mean, me also in the field and talking to hundreds of women, whether in groups or, or as clients. It is obvious that the estrogen is helping, or estrogen therapy, but not just estrogen. It could be estrogen, progesterone. We need progesterone if we have a uterus. And for some women, testosterone that we need probably more research about. But, this is not a one pill is going to solve everybody's problem. No one has the same problems. There are lots of symptoms. People need to be educated. I have no problem with estrogen, but I happen to be a person who can take estrogen. So for those who have, cancer or other chronic diseases stimulated by estrogen, this is, we need to be much more careful. But estrogen is definitely something to consider if you can take it. So that's why we're here and we educate people. We're not here to sell you stuff. We have no stakes in any pharmaceutical. But in the last series, and I mean, I thank you so much, Sandy, for explaining this so well, so thoroughly. In the last talk of this series on brain's health, menopause, and estrogen at menopause or postmenopausal, I will want to talk a little bit more about lifestyle And what we've learned from people all over the world, we want to talk about lifestyles and what possible changes can be done at the menopause transition. You know, what are those that really benefit that stage, and also aging in general. I mean, there are people who've lived in some areas of the world that lived very well, and what is their secret? And I just want to, and in that last session, I will be talking most of the time.
I get to ask you questions
And you
now.
can ask me questions. So yes, we can have a little bit of fun.
Yeah.
But thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. It was fun.
Bye.
Bye-bye.